right. Okay. How's that? Are you seeing the display view?
No, we can see your like notes and stuff.
Oh, okay. I think I can do that then. That looks good.
Yes, looks good.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining on this sort of rainy Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever it is, day of the week. I'm Kosiba. I'm an extension assistant professor of forestry here at the University of Vermont. And in my role, I do outreach and applied research that helps us understand our forests, forest ecology, and importantly, ways we can manage them differently using science and research. And I really focus on climate change and carbon. So I'll be talking about carbon today, and it is because of our changing climate that we're concerned about it. All right, so trees naturally take in carbon dioxide from the air, from the atmosphere. They do this through photosynthesis, and they use that carbon to grow, to make new wood, to make new rings of wood, to make leaves, roots, bark, all sorts of parts of the tree involve carbon, store carbon. And a nice fun fact you can share with your friends and family is that half the dry weight of wood is carbon that was removed from the atmosphere by the growing tree. And we are lucky that we have forests along with other natural ecosystems. Importantly, our wetlands, our grasslands. Here in New England, we don't have a lot of grasslands, but certainly in the Midwest and other parts of the country and world, there are. And then also oceans. So all of our natural ecosystems actually play a really important role in absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And you can see in this graph here, the blue line are our anthropogenic emissions, what we've released from the burning of fossil fuels, from clearing land, burning land, things like that. And then the red orange line is actually what's reflected in the atmosphere. You can see that luckily has not increased at the same rate as our emissions. And that is because these natural ecosystems have absorbed and taken in a great deal of this excess, more than half. In the forest, what I'm talking about here is really limited the forest carbon cycle, but just to convey the fact that forests are complex and carbon is moving around. It's in a cycle. So we have a global carbon cycle. We also within different ecosystems have a carbon cycle. And that just reflects the fact that carbon is not static. It is not permanent. It can be stored for various amounts of time in different parts of the forest, but it is really moving around in the forest. So those trees take in that carbon dioxide from the air, but that carbon then gets cycled, transferred to different parts of the forest when parts of the tree die, when leaves are shed in the fall, when trees die, when fruit is dropped and seeds are dropped to the ground. So there's a lot of cycling of that carbon from the live trees and also other plants in the forest that gets part of and gets incorporated into different parts of the forest. And then that carbon dioxide gets emitted back out in very natural ways. So the first is respiration. That's just cellular metabolism. So all living cells, release carbon dioxide back out when they're breaking apart sugars and carbohydrates for their energy and proteins and things like that. We also get release of carbon dioxide through the decomposition process. So fungi and bacteria and other microbes will release carbon dioxide back out. And then, of course, we have fire, combustion, which releases carbon dioxide. When we look at the forest, we can even break this down more granularly in what we call pools. And so these pools are places where carbon can be stored, it can be emitted, it can be sequestered. And really that, sequestration happens through that live tree pool, but then it gets transferred to these other pools. And so those pools can accumulate carbon depending on the nature of the other pools. So there's really a lot of interdependence and connectivity amongst these pools. And so a couple key terms here that sometimes get muddled in the conversation about carbon, but storage is the amount of carbon in something. And I use the analogy of a bank account. It's the amount of money you have in your bank account today, right? So it's sort of a snapshot in time, whereas carbon sequestration is the rate or the process of taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it, whether it's stored in alive trees, gets stored in dead wood when trees die, gets stored in the leaf litter when leaves are shed, or gets stored in the soil when decomposers break down organic matter and store that carbon in the soil. And so this is really a rate, it's a process. Usually we describe it as sort of like over time, maybe the amount of carbon sequestration over a year or something like that. And it's really, you can think of it the opposite of emissions. So in the bank account analogy, these are your deposits, right? It varies over time. You might deposit more this month than you do next month. And as you deposit more, your storage increases. And the reverse is true for emissions. That's sort of your withdrawals from your bank account. As you withdraw more, your storage decreases. And so that's how that dynamic occurs. In many of our forests here in the Northeast and other parts of the world, where trees are harvested, we also have an additional carbon pool in our harvested wood products. So harvested wood products, especially ones that go into long-lived products, but all harvested wood that goes into products store carbon for some amount of time. So paper products, cardboard will store it shorter amount of time than trees that go into saw logs or beams that become hardwood flooring, or veneer for furniture, or structural timbers for buildings, right? And so those can store carbon for decades, if not centuries in many cases. When we look at the difference between storage and sequestration in our forests, so I'm showing data here for Vermont, very similar. If we looked at New England or sort of the Northeast region, we have differences between these pools based on the amount of storage versus their role in sequestration. So if we look at the left-hand pie chart, this is storage, the amount of carbon in these different pools. And the big takeaway here is the brown is soil. So soils store more than half of the carbon in our forests. And this, is really a cool fact of our forests. We look at our forests and we see the trees, we see the above ground portion, but really majority of that carbon is being stored below ground in the soil. And then if we look at sequestration on the right, so this is the rate of carbon accumulation, how quickly these different pools are adding carbon and building up. We see, of course, the above ground live biomass pools. That's the above ground portion of trees. That's growing the most. That makes sense. That's where photosynthesis happens. You can see quite a bit in the below ground biomass. That's the roots. But also dead wood is accumulating very quickly. So that means we're having branches break, trees die, and that dead wood pool is getting bigger every year. The litter pool, not so much. It stays pretty steady from year to year, and we're seeing some increases in the soil pool from year to year. But the biggest contribution, or the biggest changes in carbon accumulation, are really in those live trees. One thing I wanted to talk about, I see this a lot sometimes in media articles, is a confusion between when we're talking about a tree versus a forest. And it actually is really different. Of course, forests are made of trees, but when we talk about the carbon, the conclusions and how we view carbon accumulation actually is quite different. So in a tree, carbon increases what we call exponentially, right? So you see this red line, it's increasing at a faster rate as that tree gets bigger. And so as this tree is small, it accumulates, taking carbon dioxide out of the air, and it gets bigger. As that tree grows in double the diameter, it actually has more than double of the total carbon, right? So increasingly storing more and more carbon that it has taken out of the atmosphere, which is pretty cool. So bigger trees store more carbon. That's a pretty standard rule. But when we look at a forest, it's a little bit different, because in a forest, we look at things by an area, so an acre, right? So if you have a lot of big trees, or if you have an acre of forest, there's only a few big trees that can be occupied on that acre, but you could have a lot of little trees. So when we look at an acre of forest land, this is what the carbon dynamics look like. So it's a little bit different curve on that accumulation. Not showing that increase over time. It actually shows a steady sort of plateau as the forest ages. And this is really because when forests are young, they're really dense. You've probably seen this with a young forest. There's a lot of stems in there. They're growing super close, and they're really actively trying to get taller to outcompete each other. And so there's a period of very, very active sequestration that happens in our forests that is about, depends on the forest type and the conditions, but somewhere between, 25 to maybe 70 years old is so that peak period of sequestration. And then we see it plateaus. And so that's reflected here in the storage, is that as that forest ages, that storage sort of levels off. It always is increasing, more or less, as long as there's not other disturbances. And, as you can see in this older forest I'm showing, there's dead trees, right? So some trees are dying to make space for the other big trees. And so you get more complexity in that forest stand. When we look at this by the pools, you can see this is also reflected. I was showing live tree carbon in the past graphs, but this is showing the other pools here. And you can see sort of similar trends, right? All the pools are sort of increasing, really some of them at amounts that are sort of undetectable, but I'll assure you that all those pools are increasing as that forest develops, right? You get more carbon in the soil, get more carbon in the forest floor in the deadwood. But really the biggest increase occurs when these forests are young. And then we look at sequestration, and here I'm showing this as flux because, as I mentioned, sequestration is the opposite of emissions. So we can have emissions from forests, and some forests are net emitters. And so when we talk about sequestration, we actually show it as a negative number. It's a little counterintuitive, but because we're interested in sequestration for drawing down the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so we show that as a negative. So bigger negative numbers show more sequestration. And here, again, this is an example of a maple beech birch forest showing that peak sequestration is happening about 20 years. Again, that can vary a lot depending on the forest type, the species there, sort of the other characteristics of the site, that go on and on. And so it really is important that we recognize that there is this sort of delicate balance in forests when we're talking about the mitigation role they can have for us and to sequester and store carbon. It's this balance between uptake, sequestration, transfer of carbon to those other pools, and release, so that emissions of carbon dioxide from respiration, decomposition, and combustion. And both of these factors are affected by a lot of things. They're affected by just the nature of the site. How productive is it? What are the nutrients in the soils? Is there water available for these processes to happen? What is the past management that's happened at the site? Have there been legacies of grazing or past poor management that has affected this site? What are the characteristics of the trees, the species, the ages? What management is happening or has happened in the past? Disturbances like windstorms, ice storms, and of course, things like insect and disease outbreaks. And then really importantly, climate and climate change, the stress that climate change brings can really affect all of these processes. And so it's a very complex balance, and we're still understanding what different factors affect these two processes. And so we can have situations for very natural reasons, natural disturbances, also anthropogenic reasons, why when forests actually are carbon sources. So we use these two terms to describe forests. Carbon sink is a net absorber of carbon dioxide. So that's when sequestrations are greater than emission. Your bank account is increasing in size. Storage is increasing over time. And that's most of our forests. And of course, I'll talk about this in a little bit when we look at forests over a large scale. That is the condition of our forests here in Vermont and our forests in our region. But individual stands or parcels can be carbon sources. And this is when they're net emitters of carbon dioxide, when emissions are greater than sequestration. So you can see in the left image, it's a windstorm, right? It knocks down the live trees. They're no longer sequestering carbon. You also now have all that carbon moved into the deadwood pool and the leaf litter pool with all those needles. And those will begin to be decomposed by fungi and microbes, bacteria, and that will cause greater emissions. So there's a period when this forest, until new trees occupy the space, will be a net source of carbon to the atmosphere. We can have things like insect and disease outbreaks that can cause temporary reductions in the amount of sequestration the live trees do. Usually this is sort of a blip, really minor, and the trees can recover from these impacts. Certainly things like forest fire, we're seeing this, well, in Quebec right now, right? We're getting affected by those fires, but the states out in the West Coast are actually net sources of carbon because they've been having catastrophic forest fires. That's a huge emissions of carbon dioxide stored in trees and in dead wood and in the forest floor. And then logging, we're removing carbon as from those live trees, right? Wood is carbon. And so we are removing carbon from the wood, from the woods. In all four of these examples, as long as that forest is able to remain a forest, so it's not converted to something else, we will see new trees occupying that space and new seedlings and saplings coming in. Maybe there are trees that survive these disturbances, right? Particular example, in a timber harvest, you don't remove all the trees. And so there's more space and light and resources for the remaining trees. And so you see really active sequestration. It sort of sets that forest, some of it, back to that graph where there can be really active sequestration, where you have a mix of young trees and a mix of old trees. We look at Vermont, and I saw there's a bunch of folks not from Vermont. These, I think there's folks from Mass and New Hampshire and maybe some other places, and I do have data for those states. You're also sort of in the similar boat. Forests are carbon sink. All of our states in sort of the New England, New York region, where I mostly focus, are carbon sinks. And so this is what the data look like for Vermont. We're seeing an increase in our carbon storage across our forests over time. That's great. We're very excited about that. Again, you can see majority is in our soil. We're getting a lot of storage in our soil component. For Vermont, this is about 175 years worth of our annual state emissions. So we want to keep our forests as forests and keep that carbon benefit. When we look at the sequestration rate, in Vermont, our forests sequester about 50% of our annual emissions. Region-wide in the New England, New York region, it's about 14%, and that has to do with Vermont doesn't have a very big population, and we have a lot of forests, so that ratio is pretty high for us, versus, you know, Massachusetts has a bigger population, New York State, but region-wide we have a lot of forests, and so it's about 14% of our annual emissions. So you can see, again, the sequestration is really being dominated live trees. I've combined the root part, the below ground part, and the above ground just to call them live trees, and they're doing the bulk of the work. But one thing that we're seeing here in Vermont, we're seeing some other places in the region, is our sequestration rate is declining. Again, that bigger negative numbers are more sequestration. So we're seeing that rate decline from, you know, about -8 to -6 or so in that time frame. And I'll talk about some of the things we can think about for that. But, you know, one of the big questions I hear a lot in terms of carbon, and maybe that's what you're curious to hear here, is should we stop harvesting wood to keep carbon in the forest, right? We know we're in a climate emergency. We need to keep carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We know that's true. And so would that be a good option for us to do? And I will say it's way more complex than that. And I'll talk about sort of the trade-offs and benefits we have of different management strategies. So first of all, we have two ways that forests can provide us a carbon benefit, a climate mitigation benefit. So the first is avoiding emissions. So that's keeping carbon out of the atmosphere. And so that would be the option of thinking about, okay, we want to keep carbon where it is, keep it stored in forests, and we don't want to release it. And that's great. That will reduce the amount of increases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But forests also provide active sequestration. So they take more carbon out of the atmosphere. And this is a way that we can draw down the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So you can see that we need both, right? We can't just have avoided emissions, keep everything locked away if that sequestration rate continues to decline. We really want to promote active sequestration too. And so there are ways we can think about providing both of these benefits from our forests. And one of the big reasons we think that sequestration is declining here in Vermont is because we have sort of fairly similarly aged and aging forests. So because of past land use, about 70% of Vermont, and this is similar across the other states in the region, were cleared for agriculture. And even the places that weren't cleared were often maybe grazed underneath the forest, or were harvested in ways that we wouldn't harvest today, unsustainable harvesting that maybe remove the best and biggest trees out of the forest. And so we can see that as our forest age, this is our current age distribution here in Vermont of our forests. As we age our forest naturally in another 25 years, we'll continue to get storage, but that rate of sequestration will decline, being that the forest just naturally ages and that sequestration plateaus. And the other thing that's really important when we think about possible management strategies is this importance of space and time, right? So we have a situation maybe in a forest where we do a timber harvest, or maybe a few timber harvests. And after that timber harvest, you can have a situation where the sequestration increases because you've created more space and light for the growing trees. But depending on where we look for our carbon changes, if you look right at the timber harvest, there'll be declines in the storage in that forest. But if we look over longer time frames, or had I made that dotted line even after that first peak, we can see that, oh, we actually seen an increase in carbon storage because we've ramped up that carbon sequestration rate. And so this is a hard thing to align because forests develop, they take time, and these changes can happen over, a few years or even a decade. And then also this idea of the landscape, right? So we don't harvest every location and every year. In fact, in our region, it's I think we're about a 1% harvest rate of our forests. So it's really not a lot of forests get harvested any one time. And so when one forest is being harvested, another forest is really actively sequestering. And so when we look at this landscape level, these effects are really much less pronounced. And we get this really leveling off. And so we have areas, a mosaic of areas of different ages and conditions. It gives us a lot of resilience actually to provide these carbon benefits. Of course, in our region, we are losing forest land. And this is a big concern of mine when we talk about carbon, but also all the other benefits that forests provide. Deforestation causes a loss of the stored carbon. You can think all the trees are removed, the litter layer is removed, and often the soil is impacted by grading, by removing those stumps, by site work. And so we can lose, 3/4 of the total carbon stored in a forest. Of course, we lose other things with that loss of forest, like the other, ecosystem services we love and wildlife habitat. It limits the migration of species, the ability of species to move around in a changing climate. But one important thing too is that land then does not contribute to carbon sequestration in the future. So we call this foregone sequestration. And every time we lose an acre of land, it sort of chips away at that ability of our collective forests to help us mitigate climate change. And this is showing forest loss in Vermont. I need to update this with the more recent data, but this trend has continued. And I think region-wide, we're about 20,000 acres of forest land being converted to other land uses every year. One important thing that we know about wood products, because wood is carbon, wood products store carbon for as long as they are being used. This is great. In a place like where we live, where we have forest resources and we do have resource needs. We need housing, we need affordable housing, we all need a place to live. And so using local wood products can help us continue to store that carbon. It's out of the forest, but we can have situations where that carbon gets stored, yes, decades and centuries. An additional benefit we get when we use wood, and particularly when we think of what else would we use if we didn't use wood? Well, we'd probably use steel and concrete, plastics that are made from fossil fuels. Those all are very energy intensive products. Some of these are not recyclable, like plastics. and some take long transportation distances to get to us. And so we do get additional savings. We call this a substitution effect when we use wood over those other products. It's interesting in Vermont, and I don't know as much about the other states, but I think this is true for most of the other states in the region, maybe save Maine. We are harvesting much less than we did, say, in the early 90s. And that does mean we actually have less carbon storage benefit of our wood products just because we're harvesting less. So you can see how all these different decisions have different implications. It's not as simple of just saying, let's keep the carbon in the woods. Well, we're going to either use other products, we're going to lose that carbon storage benefit of those wood products. And we would likely have impacts that are going to be out of sight, out of mind. And so this is the concept of leakage, which is really critical when we talk about carbon. So I mentioned, we have this storage benefit of forest. So say we're going to say, hey, we're not going to harvest our forest. We're going to keep all of the carbon where it is in the woods. Well, we're either going to use other products or continue to use wood, which is probably what we do. And that means we're importing that wood from elsewhere. So it could come from other parts of the country. It might come outside of the country. And a lot of these places, I will say, having spent a lot of time here in the region in private and public lands, we do really great forestry, right? We have foresters that oversee a lot of our forest operations, and we can do it in a really sustainable, ecological way. That's not true of every place that we would maybe get wood from, right? There might be less environmental oversight. There might be issues and rights abuses to the people that live and work in those places. And of course, we're also using a lot of greenhouse gases to get the wood products to us. Another issue with importing wood is it increases our likelihood of inadvertently transporting introduced insects and diseases like emerald ash borer or hemlock woolly adelgid. All of those really destructive insects you might have heard about, they come, inadvertently through shipping mechanisms. And so this is really important for us to think carefully about this concept of leakage and our resource needs. And in fact, when we look at our region, and this doesn't include New York, but this is a paper in PrEP, an analysis looking at consumption of each of our states. So that's the amount of wood products we use, and then our removal, so that's our harvest. For Vermont, here we're about 87%, but you can see some of the other states like Massachusetts is about 2%, that they harvest about 2% of the wood they use. And overall for the region, we're a little over half. And so we do have to really think about, if we don't harvest here, is there an atmospheric impact? Is the carbon benefits we want to see, are they being realized, right? One interesting fact here in our Vermont forest is we're actually growing about 3 times more wood than we are harvesting. So we do have that wood there. And that's a really important metric of sustainability that we've been using for a while, is harvesting less than growth. Usually a 2-to-1 is a great target to meet. And so we're easily meeting that objective. So there are strategies we can use to manage forest carbon and think about carbon when we're doing land planning or when we're doing forest management. And I will say we need all of these. There's no one size fits all approach that's the magic ticket for this. We really need to consider all of these approaches in our land management. And I'll talk about each one. So this is tree planting. We call it afforestation when it's places that weren't forests, and reforestation when it was previous forests. Those are sort of technical terms, but really it's tree planting. There is this great tool, if you're curious, called Reforestation Hub that quantifies the potential. Here showing Vermont and our different counties and where there's bigger potentials, mostly around agricultural land, around development. There's a lot of potential where we could plant more trees. And so I'll say that's a really easy thing. If you have a yard, if you're in a town where your streets could use more trees, great. That's a super important benefit that we could provide. And of course, there's other things, shading, wind blocking, wildlife habitat that these trees provide in those places. And this is a net gain in carbon sequestration. It doesn't result in any leakage effect. Avoided deforestation, as I already mentioned, really, really critical. It keeps the carbon in the forest and also maintains that future sequestration. It reduces what we call fragmentation or breaking up of our forest blocks. And so, looking at the difference between, okay, well, we're a passive management approach, which is one where we don't harvest timber from a parcel, versus that land could be converted into another land use and that forest is lost. You can see that the avoided deforestation gains dwarf any other management you do. And so that's really important. That's the most critical thing landowners can do, is keeping their forests as much as possible. One thing we're seeing more recently is solar development in forests and clearing of forest for solar. And so these are just, really important trade-offs we need to talk about. There's likely other places we could put solar without removing trees. We also face a biodiversity crisis. And so this is really important when we think about keeping forests as forests and reducing fragmentation. We know we've lost species in our region, and we're seeing declines in some species, like particularly insects and birds. A number of our bats are endangered. There's a lot of things like mushrooms we don't know a lot about. There's a lot of species we have not identified. And so, really it's a co-issue with climate change, is that use of our land, that keeping our forests intact and healthy is really important for all the wildlife that live and need those forests. So the next strategy, and this is one maybe you've all heard, called proforestation. This is passive management idea. We've called it reserves for a very long time. And this is a strategy that all of our states use and happens across multiple different levels in forest management. And so this is the idea: we have areas or patches of trees, or maybe even individual trees that we let live out their full lifespans, and we maximize the carbon storage. Really, we've done this for other really important goals. Old growth forests, protecting those. We have not many of those in our region. Places with high biodiversity or wildlife habitat, things we call refugia. So these are places we think might be more buffered from climate change or have really unique features. Great option of management there to make those reserves, or using a passive management approach. And again, can be applied at a range of scales throughout. It can be in a actively managed forest. It can be part of a managed forest or a separate parcel altogether. And it's important to recognize that, that passive management approach isn't great for every forest. And this is really critical. We have a history of land use in our forests that has left sometimes degraded stands. We have examples here on the right of on the left, the bigger photo, old field white pine, we call it. These are old pines that grew up on old agricultural fields. These are not healthy, resilient trees. They're very close together. They have small crowns, so that's area of the tree that has live foliage. Oftentimes, they're growing so close together that they'll have diseases or insect outbreaks. And maybe there isn't a lot going on in the understory, so there's not a lot of regeneration because there's so much shade and so much fierce competition above them. Other examples are in the top right, understories of invasive plants, right? This is unfortunately a common occurrence in our floodplain forests. Again, not a resilient forest that is going to accrue carbon over time because there's no diversity in size, age classes there. There's no young trees to take over the old trees when they die. And so cases like that, we can actually be worried about what we call a type conversion, that we'll lose the overstory trees. And that might not be a forest if there isn't a regenerating age class. And then we can have other things that are legacies of sort of introduced diseases and insects. The bottom right is beech bark disease impact. So that causes beech trees to release suckers, so small little root suckers from their roots, so small trees from their roots, and it really can outcompete all the other trees that are trying to germinate and survive from a seed. And so this reduces the species diversity in a forest. It can go through these fluctuations of getting killed by beech bark disease, suckering, and getting killed by beech bark disease. So again, the carbon accumulation is going to vary over time, and there'll be a lot of fluctuation. So, really important when we talk about carbon is assessing the site, assessing its vulnerabilities, and making sure we're choosing an appropriate technique, whether it is active or passive management, that is best suited to advance the resilience of that forest. And of course, we have climate change that can bring more disturbances and carbon losses. And there's a lot of things here, wild cards. We don't really know exactly what the climate will bring and how climate change will interact with things like diseases and insects, invasive plants, right? And we're already seeing, this is a study that came out a couple months ago. We're already seeing that there are some impacts of pests and disturbances that are reducing carbon dioxide mitigation from our forests. So when we talk about forests, really some important things are vulnerabilities to assess. So that is the degree to which a forest is susceptible and unable to recover from climate change. And we know that certain forest conditions and disturbances can make a forest more or less vulnerable to climate change impacts. And then resilience is the ability of a forest to recover or adapt following disturbance or change. And this is what we're striving for in our forests. We want them to be resilient. We want them to be able to respond if there is a disturbance as a forest, that they still remain a forest and provide all the ecosystem benefits that forests provide. They might change in composition or sort of structure, what they look like, but they remain a functioning, healthy forest. And so I've broken this up into 3 buckets of vulnerabilities to assess. And so the first one of those are conditions of the forest that can affect tree regeneration in the future forest. So these are things like, example in that photo, invasive plant populations, especially big ones that are sort of out-competing regeneration of trees. So if you don't see a lot of seedlings and saplings, really importantly, so those are sort of the small to medium-sized trees, you don't have a forest that can replace the overstory when there is mortality or there is some sort of disturbance that happens. And so we know that things like deer browse can really reduce the success of regeneration, especially certain species. So we do want to see a diversity of species in this regeneration layer. We also have other stressors that occur, like earthworms and things like that, that there is some evidence that is affecting our regeneration too. So really paying, walking around your woods, looking at the regeneration and maybe talking to a forester to assess, do I have sufficient regeneration in my forest? And are there things I could do to help enhance it? The other middle bucket are the mature trees, the trees that are there that you see, the big canopy trees, but they can have vulnerabilities too, and might suggest that they're less resilient to extreme disturbance events. So these are things like in this photo, maybe they're all the same species and all the same size, right? So a disturbance that comes in and affects a certain species will affect all of those trees. There's not a diversity of species. There's not a diversity of size classes in that forest. And that photo shows they're very skinny. Again, they have very small crowns relative to their total height. That is also not a great sign of resilience. It can also be that maybe the stems are damaged from past land use. So you see lots of rot on the trees. And so thinking about trees that are built to last, that can withstand stressors. And then a third bucket are conditions of the forest that affect soils and water quality. So these are things like soil erosion, right? It's very common in our forests in our region to have old roads like pictured here that might have been used decades ago, but were never properly closed out with drainage. And so water just flows down the road, and over the years has caused significant erosion. And as we see with climate change, we're getting more rainfall events and bigger, heavier rainfall events. And so that is very vulnerable to increased erosion. We want to keep the soil where it is. We want to keep the water where it is. So things you can do on trails and roads, making water diversion structures like water bars and dips. You really want to think about slow, spread, and sink water. So that's slowing it down. Whatever you can do, you can use logs, dead wood to slow it down, spread it out. So trying to divert it into areas where it can slowly be absorbed in the forest where it's needed most, right? So not just channelizing the water and getting it out of the forest as quickly as possible. We want to keep it where it is. That means it keeps water, nutrients, soil in place as much as possible. And so we do know that forests with more species and trees of many sizes, ages, conditions, including things like having dead standing trees, having dead logs and branches on the ground. We want to see things like irregular gaps in the canopy. So just irregular forests that are not as uniform. We know that those are characteristics of more resilient forests. Because that means when their disturbance comes, disturbances don't affect all species the same, and they don't affect all tree ages and sizes the same. So we have sort of these two big buckets. I'll talk about some strategies in the next slide, but big buckets, increasing species diversity, increasing what we call structural complexity. So that's having multiple layers of canopy in the forest. So young trees, middle-aged trees, mature trees, having complexity across the forest. So gaps in the canopy. And so you can see there's two different, showed the left-hand image already, but sort of a simple, not structurally diverse, not species diverse forest. And then on the right, ones with multiple species, you can see there's multiple sizes of trees. There's sort of gappiness. That's a much more resilient forest. And so there's a range of things we can do for thinking about active management to improve the resilience of our forests. And I already talked about regeneration and focusing on diversity, complexity, and species diversity. So we can do things like maybe thinning really dense stands to promote more vigor and growth of the remaining trees. We can focus timber harvest on areas that might be at higher risk for disturbances. So that white pine stand could be susceptible to a windstorm. And maybe that makes sense to harvest part of that or some of it or the whole thing and really encourage more species to establish in that site. Another good strategy is keeping large trees or areas, clumps of trees as reserves, right? So this can occur within active management. And that ensures we kind of balance that storage and sequestration benefit of the forest. Things that are great to do is promoting deadwood. So this is fluxing carbon from live tree pool to the deadwood pool. So you can do things like felling and leaving trees in place, letting trees just, live out their natural lifespan and become deadwood. Folks are doing things like girdling trees, which just means cutting the chainsaw around a tree and letting it die standing. So it can create that structure in the deadwood at once. Of course, there are strategies we can use when we are in the woods, whether you're in the woods with logging equipment, ATV, on hiking trails, minimizing impacts of soils. That means making sure soils are dry and or frozen. So wet soils are really to be avoided. That's when we see the most impacts to soils. And harvesting, trying to harvest wood for long-lived products as much as possible. So managing your forest that can grow, good wood that can go into some of these saw timbers or beams or things like that are structural products. Of course, these are all strategies to increase resilience. And so by doing this, we can do things like creating complexity. So there's some examples of forest management that's happened to do this, encourage a range of age classes. We can also do things like promote wildlife habitat through this, right? Birds, a lot of our forest birds really need some of these structural attributes. They need some gaps in the canopy for feeding, for provisioning food, for rearing young. And so this really bodes well for those species and a lot of other species. We can sustainably harvest resources at the same time and get what I call resilient forest carbon, right? So we have a healthier, more resilient forest. That means it's going to provide those storage and sequestration benefits into the future as well. And, things that we can think of more broadly in our region is using wood instead of other products. I love this. This is a hockey rink from Canada, of course. And instead of using I-beams, steel I-beams, they used wood. So they got long-term carbon storage, avoided emissions of not using those other products. And of course, if those wood products come locally, they get local community economic resilience and sovereignty in doing that. So that's a pretty cool project, and it just looks beautiful as well. And so, this is really critical when we think about carbon management. Is again, the no one size fits all. We have a lot of different goals and objectives for our forests, and thinking about ways to balance them across our landscape. And it really is about risk spreading. We don't want all of our forests to be in exactly the same condition or to have all the same species. We want to really diversify, because as things move forward, when we do encounter a disturbance, some weird, wacky weather, like we saw with this late spring frost we had a couple weeks ago, having a diversity of conditions and species across our landscape really does set us up for the best success. Quickly, I just wanted to, I'm almost wrapped up, but I just wanted to mention, because I have a feeling folks are interested in carbon offsets. So I just have a couple really short amount here. I'm not going to get into a lot of details, but one thing I know folks are interested in, or they've heard about carbon offsets as a way to help them manage their forest for the carbon benefit. And I will just say, this really ties into all what I was talking about, sort of like the two ways that we can think of our forests of storing carbon, keeping carbon stored, or increasing sequestration. The interesting thing with carbon offsets, you're actually selling that power, that carbon credit, to another entity. And so this, sorry about that. So this is really important. So, it's just this entity is releasing emissions, and they're going to pay you either to sequester more or to keep carbon out of the forest. Maybe that land could be developed, and you're going to put a conservation easement on it, so it can't be developed. And right, so this is a trading. They're essentially buying that carbon from you, and they're using it to sort of negate their carbon impacts. And so, I just want to say that before you delve into a program, make sure you're asking a lot of questions from the developer. They're really complex, and each one is very different. And so I'd really encourage you to ask questions about who can buy offsets, how long the contract is, what happens if you sell your land, and are different management options allowed. And particularly with our states that have a current use program, if you're enrolled in current use, make sure that enrolling in a carbon program doesn't make you ineligible to that current use program. And making sure it's right for you with these long-term contracts, talking to your family members, talking to maybe a lawyer or a tax accountant on the implications of this revenue source, because there are restrictions on future management, what you do, and some of these have contracts that are 20 years or more. And I will say, be very cautious about entering them and recognize what they are and what they aren't. The actual climate impacts of a carbon offset program really vary. There's been a lot of research to look in, are we actually seeing atmospheric benefits from these carbon programs? And it varies based on the landowner, what your original intentions are, by the buyer of the offsets, and of course, market forces that sort of drive these processes. So, I'm happy to talk to folks more about this. And I have a bunch of resources on my website. I'll give you those at the end, but I would encourage folks to really do their due diligence if you're thinking about entering one of these. There are also some programs that are not carbon offsets. The EQIP program works to have cost share for certain practices. So if you're interested in that, talk to your consulting forester in Vermont, your county forester. If you're outside of Vermont, service forester, you can talk to your local NRCS office. And there's some other programs in development that are going to pay landowners for certain practices to be determined exactly how those will work. But recognize that there's a lot of interest in thinking about ways that we can maximize or improve the carbon benefit of our forests in our region. And so just to leave you with a couple resources, I have my UVM Extension Forestry website. I have some resources from some other collaborators I work with on forest carbon. I've been writing a series on forest carbon for Northern Woodlands magazine. And so this is the first one. You can access it for free on my website. I also just wrote one on soil carbon that's there too. I have resources for managing your forest with climate change in mind. So it touches on some of the things I talked about here, but a little bit more about promoting resilience and adaptation in your forest. And then I'm also part of this regional program called Securing Northeast Forest Carbon. And you can find access to that website again on my forestry website. And that has all sorts of things about carbon markets, carbon, science, webinar links, all sorts of things like that. And if you're in Vermont, I really encourage you to connect with some local landowner groups, Vermont Woodlands and Vermont Coverts, who have really good e-newsletters that I use to, put out a lot of this information. All right, and with that, I am done, and I'm happy to take some questions if there are any. You want me to read them, Jillian, or I see one came in the chat.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't notice
No
that. Yeah,
All right.
so it says,
ahead.
how do we balance managing forests for resilient forest carbon, but also to minimize wildfire impacts, particularly around houses/structures?
Yeah, the wildfire concern is interesting because our region, well, I'll say particularly in Vermont, there are some spots in our region that have historically had fires, but in Vermont, we are not a fire-prone state. We have a couple types of forests that do have fire in them. They're really localized, limited. When we do have fires in our state, they're 1 acre, maybe up to 5 acre fires that aren't like the catastrophic fires that they have out on the West Coast. It's just not the dynamics of our forests and sort of the nature of how our forests disturbances that happen. They call them asbestos forests here because they don't burn. We have a lot of moisture. There is concern with changing climate that we might see increases in forest fires. Certainly something I've noticed this spring and into the summer that we've had high fire danger for a pretty long time. So we could see an increase in forest fire. I think, sort of the houses structures issue is probably not as big of an issue here as it is in some places I've visited out west, where you really have people who have built houses in fire-prone forests. We do have more sort of villages in our region that have a little bit more concentrated use. And so, it's certainly a concern if you are really in the middle of a forest, especially a fire-prone forest, protecting your house. So, I think the same principles that they use out west probably apply of keeping trees away from your house. And so I think, that's sort of one of those trade-offs is probably not going to have huge carbon implications just because of, the number of trees you'd have to remove to protect your house. But it is a good thing to think about for, landowners. If you are in a place that you think might be prone to fires, that might be a risk.
Do we have any other questions? All right, if no one has anything else, we can finish up a little early. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Allie. That was really interesting and informative.
Thanks, everybody.
Right. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.